Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm Robert Hackett. I'm a senior writer at Fortune Magazine, and I co-lead the Ledger there, which is our fintech crypto blockchain franchise. Thanks for joining us. I'm here with some of the leaders of some of the top blockchain projects in the world. We'll go down the line and do some introductions. Brad Garlinghouse. Shall we? I'll introduce you. Okay. Brad Garlinghouse, CEO of Ripple. I'm sure you're all acquainted. We've got Brian Behlendorf, who leads the blockchain group within the Linux Foundation.
And called Hyperledger.
Hyperledger. And Joe Lubin, who is our host, and we're very grateful for him for having this and sponsoring this right now, in charge of ConsenSys. So thank you again. This is something I like to do, is just test the waters here and ask the audience, who here thinks that blockchain is overhyped? Raise your hand if you think blockchain's overhyped. Okay, we've got our panelists even in the mix. All right, it seems like...
Let's hype it. So let's talk about...
Yeah, okay. It's overhyped, but you're leading some of these projects, so what's behind that? Brad, maybe you can...
You're a journalist. You tell us why it's overhyped.
Is it my fault?
Not your fault.
I think that there's a lot of interesting things happening in the blockchain space for sure, and I think some of them are represented here. But there's also a lot of things we read about and hear about that you're like, that just doesn't make any sense. There's use cases people are pursuing that I can't get my head around. I mean, we of course can make fun of it, some of the long tail. There's a banana coin that did an ICO. Kodak coin did an ICO apparently. You're just things like, I just scratch my head. And so when I say, is the category overhyped? Look, it's hard not to argue when you go from a 20 billion market cap at the beginning of 2017 to 850-ish billion market cap across all tokens, back to, I think it's 120-ish today. It's hard not to say we've gone through some hype. That isn't to say there aren't real problems that can be solved with these technologies, and they are profound in many cases. I've seen a lot of these projects, I can't get my head around why a database doesn't work more efficiently.
So I'm told this is called the sauna room, so Joe, I've got to put you in the hot seat.
Can I answer that question also?
Yeah, please.
Sure. So blockchain is overhyped because humans tend to operate on a fear-greed cycle. With respect to any technology that is exciting in terms of its impact on how we structure our society, in terms of whether people are going to be able to make lots of money from it, we're going to see some sort of exuberance, often irrational, and then we're going to see some sort of correction because there will be over-exuberance. And so the blockchain technology is the first technology to come along in a few decades that I think is as profound as the internet and web technologies. Probably much more profound just because the internet and web technologies were about messaging and about publishing information, essentially the internet of information. Blockchain is going to enable us, instead of interacting with that profound societal shift technology, instead of interacting from flat screens, sort of a two-dimensional representation of the information that's out there, it's going to permeate time and space. So it's going to be infused in the Internet of Things, in the Internet of People, decentralized identity. It's going to be pretty much everywhere. And so if people can get a piece of that, and they can get a piece of that because this trust infrastructure that blockchain enables us to build natively digital assets. And so now we have magic internet money that's infused into this technology, unlike what we had in '89 with the web technology advent. And so you give so many people around the world this opportunity to get financially immediately involved in it, and it's going to be many hype bubbles followed by many corrections, I believe.
You mentioned a fear and greed cycle. Where are we on the spectrum between fear and greed right now?
I think we're trending up, probably. So we had, as you're all aware, in 2017, there was tremendous excitement, and there was a natural and healthy correction. Regulators and just general sentiment has calmed some of the unhealthy activity, some of the poor projects, some of the fraudulent projects, and that initial wave of excitement brought so many more consumers into the space, so many more journalists into the space, many entrepreneurs and technologists. And once the entrepreneurs and technologists see the technology, they can't unsee the technology. They can't go back to building Web 2.0, you are the product kind of approaches and sort of steal your personal information and try to sell you. They're essentially building the next wave, decentralized World Wide Web, Web 3.0, and the activity right now is astonishing. The ecosystem is probably 2 orders of magnitude bigger, and we're on an upswing.
Who here in the audience owns cryptocurrency? Pretty much everyone. And how many people lost money on cryptocurrency? A lot of people. Okay.
Realized?
Sorry.
Lost money if you sold
Realized?
something.
Yeah. Gotta huddle.
On paper?
Brian, it looked like you wanted to say something. Jump in here.
Another kind of way of thinking of that kind of resonance and waves is that most meaningful technologies get overestimated in the short term and underestimated in the long term. And I think, pick your starting point. Is it Satoshi's paper? Is it the Ethereum ICO? Is it the launch of Hyperledger? Whatever. I think in many ways we're at that cutover point between short term and long term, where the overhyped expectations did drive a lot of investment, did drive a lot of people out of their shell, and you could argue is necessary for them to take a risk and try things out, and a lot of people got burned, and that's fine. But the fraction of those that did not, or the fraction of the experiments that work out, lay the seeds for what the Gartner hype cycle they call the plateau of productivity, right? And I would say in many cases we're on that growing plateau, or the slope of enlightenment, and then you get to the plateau of productivity, right?
That's a ski trail in the Alps, right?
Right.
The slope of enlightenment.
Now I think I've completely surrendered my techie kind of like credentials by citing all that. But no, at least in the side of the community that we see people deploying these things in production, over 100 different production networks out there on these technologies, doing trade finance, doing supply chain traceability, doing healthcare records and medical claims, doing all sorts of different use cases, including in digital identity, where there's very pragmatic value being created, very pragmatic-minded people building these systems, and it's just a function of time for that momentum to grow.
So I'd like to ask you about this McKinsey report that was recently released about enterprise blockchain. They had their own sorts of diagrams, and they were talking about how enterprise blockchain has halted. It's stopped growing past the prototype phase. It's not been able to make this transition into the product phase. Did you see this report? Was
this the one that was characterized in it was not The Guardian, but one of the other publications that's 0.00%?
Probably.
Enterprise. I don't know who they talk to. Like there are these networks out there, whether it's We.Trade or the China Minsheng Bank or the Sovereign Network in the digital identity space that's launching this quarter. These are out there, and I didn't look into the details to kind of see what their methodology was. I think there is a high standard that eventually these networks should be held to. We don't really have an accounting standard to help us understand the value that these networks are being created to the same degree of 10 decimal point fidelity that we do with a token, right? There's no coin market cap for consortial ledgers out there, and maybe there will be someday. But that's I think a challenge in terms of helping people understand where value is being created and how the tech is being deployed.
Yeah, so for our company, we probably focus about half on the public blockchain infrastructure, building products on top of it. But we have a professional services group we have for nearly 4 years. And it's half of our company. In 2017, we did lots of proofs of concept. In 2018, we're building out very big projects. Congo is a commodity trade finance project, 10 banks, super major energy companies like Shell. And it looks like in 2019 we did about very small tens of millions of dollars of business, and that's just the ConsenSys company. The Ethereum platform is being used probably in par with Hyperledger Fabric, probably neck and neck in terms of the number of projects that corporations or consortia are building on the technology. And we are seeing already probably 5x the activity going into 2019. I think Sophia's sitting over there. Sophia and her team at Kaleido have built blockchain as a service for Ethereum, and I think you've seen 1,900, something like that, 1,900 consortia or enterprises on the platform. They track those projects very carefully. I think it's around 40% started using it and continue using it, and it's far and away the most elegant point-and-click blockchain as a service platform. They've basically made it easy for corporations to use it. So we're seeing nothing but growth in the enterprise space. There really hasn't been anything like a crypto winter in the enterprise space.
One quick thought on this, on the McKinsey point particularly. I think part of this depends on how you ask the question, and even McKinsey. If you start with, are you using blockchain, I think is almost the wrong way to think about it. Silicon Valley in particular has been guilty for decades with, here's a technology in search of a problem versus a problem in search of a technology. About a year ago, I was asked on stage at an event of, hey Brad, is Ripple a blockchain company or a crypto company? And I said, no, we're a payments company. We happen to use blockchain and crypto to solve a payments problem.
You're an internet company, right?
I just look at it and think that I did look at some of the McKinsey report and just feel like, yes, it's appropriate that people are downplaying that a little bit. Joe answered a question earlier about where we're in the fear of greed, and he said we're on the upslope. Look, I think we're on the downslope. I think that the fear has increased in the context of, are there real problems being solved? Or is there really an ROI against using these technologies as compared to a database? And I think McKinsey may have been doing their research at a time when I think people are increasingly asking themselves hard questions that, hey, I spent X million dollars on a proof of concept, did it yield a return? In a lot of cases, the answer was no. That does not mean all cases. I'm not familiar with the project Joe was talking about. I was talking to a guy named Mohammed here earlier working on Meridio. There are a lot of interesting use cases that can be used. The blockchain technologies make a lot of sense. There's a lot that have been pursued that make no sense. And the whole industry needs to mature.
Can you name some that don't make sense?
Yeah, exactly. So Brian can name lots that do make sense, and I can name lots that do make sense. And people are pointing to projects that some may be ill-conceived, but I think the general sentiment that there's so many applications that shouldn't be built on a blockchain, it does make sense if your view is that it's a sort of point technology that you can apply. If your view is that it is a transformation in how we're going to build IT systems, where instead of siloed systems, we're going to be building collaborative systems, and instead of interfacing with credit card infrastructure, we're going to have native digital assets, then it does make sense to start getting familiar with the technology, and it does make sense because phase 3 of your project is probably going to have more collaboration or digital assets, and you may as well start building for the future.
I think there's a horizon thing too. I think there are use cases that don't make sense today, that as the costs come down, as the technologies get more widely adopted and such, that will make sense in the future. One example might be ride hailing, right? Ride hailing in the form of Uber or Lyft is the kind of application where central organizations make a lot of sense, from vetting the riders to and vetting the drivers, right, and the riders, and pulling a market together really quickly. Now, I could say that, and I'm sure Joe would say, well, there's a DApp for that, and I think there is even, and in fact,
not a good one. No.
Oh, okay, but there could be that over the course of a few years, both the end user interfaces, the ability to do ratings in a decentralized way, in a trustworthy way, all evolve to make that suddenly a use case that makes sense. And so I don't know that I can really sit here and say this is something that'll never be a distributed ledger.
Sure. And being able to share your identity and more so your reputation across an Airbnb-like application and a ride-sharing-like application, I think that sort of collaboration is going to be important.
Brian, I like your point about timing because we like to think about the dot-com bubble and how it was zany ideas that were raising tons of money and they all flamed out. But there were some ideas that eventually stuck later on, like Webvan was a famous flame out during that era, and now you've got Uber Eats, which is a big and growing part of Uber's own business. One of the biggest private companies today, probably going for an IPO this year. But what applications do you see right now that are in the short term not working out or not worth it?
I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time on that.
Okay.
Because I'm so focused on the ones who do, in our community, who are using the technology and growing their applications. I don't really have a nice kind of overview of what's failed.
Well, then tell me this. How do you go about sussing out what's a good
Well, I mean,
trigger word?
So we're upstream. We're upstream from all that. As the Linux Foundation, as Hyperledger, what we're focusing about is the people who show up to our party and want to use the code. We'll help them use it. But we don't. And if they report a bug, and here's where to report it. If you want to help us fix it, want to help us build the next version of the code or bring a new code base in, that's great. But that ends up being very organic, bottoms up, and it does mean we get this filter of the stuff that's succeeding or the stuff that people believe should be possible. And there's a constant churn there of developer tools and that sort of thing. These things go through generations. But in terms of stuff getting deployed on the ground, there's certainly areas that are earlier than others. I mean, healthcare is still early. There's some use cases in healthcare, like provider directories, or as I mentioned, the routing of health insurance claims. But medical records is still a moonshot. That could take a decade before we really get to where we should be with users at the center of health information sharing. And some of that has nothing to do with the technology. It has to do with the disincentives for organizations to share, even though they're regulatorily required to in the United States to share patient records with the patient. And so that's where, some of it has nothing to do with the technology. It has to do with market structure and the participants in those markets.
So Joe, I want to return to a point you mentioned earlier. You mentioned that ConsenSys has a professional services arm, and as I understand, it's one of the bigger, more profitable parts of the business.
Yes, the most profitable.
The most profitable. Yes. So I want to ask about how you go about squaring the circle when it comes to Ethereum talks about decentralizing the world, kind of switching everything to these open source kind of community owned projects, whereas there's another side where there are these big corporations and they give you money. So how do you kind of walk that balance? What's the tension there?
So there are many voices in the Ethereum space, and some of them are about nothing but radical decentralization. Some of them are more pragmatic. Most of the people in the Ethereum ecosystem have been quite pragmatic, and it's about building better systems for people. And so if one can build add some decentralization to a use case, to a consortium to make it operate better, then I think that's a great use of increased decentralization. I do believe that decentralized infrastructure will get very inexpensive and pervasive and scalable and private and confidential. It's going to take time to get there. We're going to have the same thing with respect to decentralized storage and decentralized access to bandwidth. And so we need to start where we are, which is a world of silos and walled gardens and enterprise databases built on legacy database technology. But we can start as the foundational unit of IT infrastructure, and we can start making that collaboration, and that's going to transform society. And so we're on the Ethereum public mainnet side, we're building out that infrastructure, and we're trying to build as decentralized applications as we can, and a lot of the time we take shortcuts because we just need to make stuff work. On the enterprise side, getting a whole lot of banks and in trade finance and energy companies and traders together in a consortium context where before they couldn't do that because they couldn't agree on where the machines are going to be, who's going to own the protocol. Now they all own the protocol. And so that sort of system, when the public mainnet is ready, or different decentralized protocols already, that sort of private permissioned system can be placed on top of public blockchain and decentralized storage infrastructure, just the same way that we've seen corporations move to the internet, to the web, and eventually to cloud. It takes time for them to get comfortable, and it takes time for the technology to get mature enough to support it.
I believe you've gone on the record saying that you're going to put more emphasis on projects getting revenue within ConsenSys. Given the price declines that have happened with Ethereum over the past year, tell us what does...
So we're going to put more emphasis on revenue in our projects.
Okay.
So
Tell me...
a bit of a subtle distinction there.
Gotcha. Tell me what the next phase of ConsenSys looks like.
Sure. So we came about essentially 4 years ago as really an extension of the Ethereum project. It was about continuing the vision and mission of Ethereum and doing things that that a Swiss-based foundation couldn't and shouldn't do. And it was about adoption. It was about education. It was about showing up and doing something cool and making a splash. Going to Davos last year, and we weren't sure whether it was just going to be empty here and purple, or but it was purple and vibrant here. It was astonishing, actually, how much blockchain was in the consciousness of this little town 1 year ago, and I think we were reasonably successful in fostering adoption for the Ethereum technology, for the blockchain ecosystem in general. And at this point, many organizations are rushing into our ecosystem because now they too have identified it as one of the next major waves in the evolution of information technology. And so the press jumped all over it, but we did a rebalancing. There were 13% of jobs that we felt shouldn't exist anymore at ConsenSys, and since then we've hired another 100 people into jobs that should exist at ConsenSys, and so we got jumped all over because we were essentially streamlining our professional services group to compete better in certain regions and focusing on essentially turning, instead of opportunistic investing, instead of incubating a huge number of projects, turning that into a more streamlined investment pipeline where we start with our Tachyon accelerator and only incubate some of the truly exceptional companies.
You mentioned some of the reports. One of them that I had read talked about how people within the company are feeling a little bit on edge, that they don't know whether their jobs are secure. What might you tell your employees to boost their morale?
Oh, we already have told our employees what we have to tell them. We told them that that was a one-time event. There won't be another event like that in the foreseeable future, at least. And our labs team, I think Sean and Ron are sitting there. Our labs team is working with all of our different projects. We've been making our projects ready for external investment for a long time. BlockApp spun out 3 years ago. Trustology was recently invested in by 2 Sigma. There's another project here. I don't know if I should say anything publicly. So there are other projects that have been talking to VCs for a very long time, and it's always been our ethos that we incubate projects and we want them to spin out. We want them to be part of the ConsenSys mesh as their own externalized legal entity. A project called Gnosis spun out 2.5, 3 years ago. They did a successful token launch, raised millions of dollars in that token launch, and Jeremy and I are on calls with them every week, roughly. We have so much interaction between our different groups. Many of our different teams are working with their prediction market technology and their decentralized exchange technology. So they're still a deep part of the ConsenSys mesh. There was a communication fairly soon after all the sensationalization in the media that things are fine and we're just back to growing at this point.
So Ethereum has long been the number 2 blockchain next to Bitcoin. So I've got to ask you, Brad, how does it feel that XRP has now claimed the second spot?
I have a couple thoughts on this. One is the coin market cap rankings, that sometimes are number 2, XRP sometimes number 2, sometimes number 3. I really do think for the whole industry, I think hopefully most people here agree with this, this is a marathon and not a sprint, and measuring the success of any platform in the day-to-day, hour-to-hour is a fool's errand. So I think all of the major platforms are working on interesting use cases to the extent they're successful and they're scaled successes, then I think we're still at the very nascent stages of these markets. And so I don't consider what Ethereum is doing in any way competitive with what's going on in the XRP ecosystem. Is there some overlap on occasion? Sure, probably. But I think you're going to see things play out over a long time. I think mostly we're all up here aligned with we want to see the overall market healthy and mature. I believe in something that Ripple has certainly championed is a need for more and more transparency. There's a lot of ways that even up here we've used words like decentralization that, that's a pretty nuanced word. We talk about Bitcoin and even Ether as being decentralized, yet we've got the mining dynamics, which means that, well, maybe it's decentralized. You've seen these 51% attacks, Ethereum Classic recently. These are real issues. And I think in order for the whole industry to mature, we kind of have to not pretend they aren't real issues and acknowledge the issue, speak of them, talk about how we're going to solve them, or be willing to admit, hey, here's a whole bunch of projects using blockchain that aren't going to work. And even I applaud what Joe and the leadership team at ConsenSys has done, is said, look, some of these things maybe weren't perfectly aligned. Let's make some changes. I think that's, 2018 was kind of a hangover. I'm optimistic that some of the things that were needed to get cleaned up did get cleaned up in 2018. And, we're, I think as an industry in a better place going into 2019.
Now, you mentioned this word decentralized. One of the criticisms that sometimes gets leveled against Ripple is that people say it's centralized because it owns a lot of XRP. What would you say to them?
It's not a proof of stake model. So owning a lot of something does not give you control over something. The XRP ledger is an open source, decentralized technology. There's about over 150 validators that kind of manage that network. Ripple today manages fewer than 5% of those nodes, those validators. We can't enforce upon the XRP ledger anything that the XRP ledger doesn't want to adopt. So I think that people confuse, and there's a lot of FUD, fear, uncertainty, doubt. There's a lot of misinformation that gets propagated. And I think that there are holy wars. There's financial interests in what happens here. And so people talk about the XRP ledger being centralized, I think, because they want to paint it that way. The XRP ledger is more decentralized than mining-based solutions because of the nature of proof of work and the centralization of proof of work mining that's happened, particularly in China.
Joe, you look like you want to say something.
Let me jump in there just because Amanda's going to be happy if we have a little bit of controversy. XRP is a value token and it trades in an open market. If the CFTC noticed that you owned 60% of the silver supply, how comfortable would they be?
I won't speak for the CFTC. We have in escrow 55% of all of the XRP that we own. We can't sell it. We can't do anything with it. So we actually own about 13%.
But you do sell it regularly, right? Don't you sell it into the market?
We're very transparent about that. How much do you sell?
When necessary. Sure.
And look, I'm talking about transparency because I think for the whole industry to mature, we need to be transparent in the industry. Ripple, I think, has tried to lead by example with that. And I think there's other ecosystems that I have no idea what's going on in those ecosystems. And I don't think that's good for the whole industry. And so I think that's bad for Ripple, too.
But they're decentralized in terms of ownership of the token.
Ownership of token is decentralized insofar as they work on a proof of stake. If it's a mining-based protocol, then centralization is based upon the mining control, not ownership.
One small aspect of the governance of the ecosystem could be considered centralized if you're talking about the mining aspect, sure. How centralized in terms of token ownership is your ecosystem?
I'm glad that we just work on the software. We leave the governance issues to other people because there will be differences of opinion about the right way to build these kind of governance networks, right? And there will be some very large networks. There'll be some really tightly closed ones. But it's good to have competition. And I think between the abstract notion and how these things should work, and frankly, between the people behind the organizations that serve as either the direct or indirect governance organizations around these networks. So this is a healthy debate to have in front of an audience. It's something that's never will get resolved. Will be a continual debate. We see this in earlier technology waves too. Control versus decontrol, if you want to think of it that way. Control versus, not chaos, but like, there's a resonance there.
So Brian and I shared a really wonderful 2-hour car ride back from a retreat 3 years ago, and Brian swore that there would never be a hypercoin. So we are friends at IBM. We talk to them. They're very interested in coins now, and our friends at R3 are interested.
Yeah, sure. So just to understand. So Hyperledger technologies, Fabric, Sawtooth, et cetera, you stand up your own blockchain networks with them. And on every one of those networks, there are digital assets. Those might be identities, those might be certifications, they might be frequent flyer miles, right? They could be fiat currencies or even a novel, cryptocurrencies, just you don't mine these currencies. What I was saying is you'll never see Hyperledger,
an ICO.
Foundation, ICO, or say, here is the standard backend token to connect all the different networks, right? And it's just a different approach. It's very similar to the difference between open source software and commercially licensed software, where it's intrinsic motivators that drive collaboration around open source code, rather than the explicit kind of like funding of individual developers, that sort of thing.
So to return to a point that, Brad, you were making, Joe, it's been said that you are one of the biggest Ethereum holders.
It has been said. I've heard that. Yeah.
Yes.
Based on no data.
How do you go about managing your treasury within ConsenSys and your own personal one?
I guess no comment. So we personally, in terms of ConsenSys, we are a small fraction of the Ethereum asset and all the assets on the Ethereum platform, and we manage our treasury like a company would manage its treasury.
The only interjection I have here is I find it interesting that Ripple is attacked for being transparent. Because we are very proactive, and we put actually the next XRP markets report, which we do quarterly, will come out sometime the end of this week. But because we share that information, then we're attacked for it, yet other platforms don't share that information, and so they are insulated from those same critiques and criticisms. I think in the dictionary that's called hypocrisy. I'm not 100% sure, but it's close.
Is there any plan for greater transparency within ConsenSys in terms of how it deploys its Ethereum?
Internally, sure. And we're a private company, and we
Ripple's a private company too.
Absolutely. And transparency is important to us, but we also have to be strategic about information that we release, and with respect to those sorts of issues, I haven't really thought too much about whether we need to disclose how we pay people, when we pay people, etc. It's just operating a company.
Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the adoption of cryptocurrency within other industries and within corporations. So, Brad, one of the things that your business maybe not hinges on, but one of its promises is that banks will adopt XRP. They'll get used to transacting in it. But this crypto stuff is very different from what they're used to using. How do you get financial firms comfortable with this new world?
Well, and actually, as Brian just referenced, I think people ask me, why am I here in Davos? I spend a lot of time going around the world talking to central banks, talking to finance ministries, talking to regulators about how digital assets are being used. Unfortunately, a lot of times, and you, I'm sure, have this experience also, and I'm sure many of us do, you go and talk to somebody about a digital asset, and the first thing they think of is you say the word crypto, they think Silk Road. And you're like, well, wait a minute, a lot has changed since Silk Road, and there are a lot of very legitimate use cases. I mean, Brian and I were talking before the panel with Joe, and he said that some of these, I won't use your math, 'cause I don't know it was public, but some of the platforms that are using Hyperledger have 50 million transactions going on per day. I mean, that is awesome. That is unbelievable. And I think about what Ripple is doing, and I think the more we can show and demonstrate that XRP this isn't fueling just speculation. It's actually solving a problem for payment providers, for banks. We've now we publicly launched the product that uses XRP for bank transfers called XRapid. About 4 months ago, we've launched 8 customers publicly we've talked about. We announced the first bank using XRapid recently. So, it was only a year ago that the New York Times was quoting, they went and wrote an article about it. No one's ever going to use XRP for any payment flows. That's not true. And I think we'll continue to prove that if you are using technologies to solve a real problem and you're improving the cost, improving the scalability, improving the speed, people are going to adopt it, even if it is new and different. But you're right, a lot of banks, a lot of regulators, it takes time for them to understand what are the implications of this and to get their head around. An XRP transaction that Ripple's enabling does not circumvent KYC, AML, OFAC compliance, all these things. And once they get comfortable with that, like, oh, okay.
Joe, I'd like to ask the same question about Ether. How do you get corporations interested and excited and comfortable with using a technology like this?
So it's happening. I mean, there are at least more than 200,000 developers. We think the number is quite a bit higher. And on the public side of the ecosystem, there are tens of thousands of companies that are either building out in the public infrastructure, either building games or building in the journalism industry or building in the music industry, including our company. Many other industries, supply chain is being heavily used. Commodity trade finance, interbank cross-border payments. We don't really have to push too hard to interest companies in taking a look at the technology. And there are essentially 2 major platforms that when corporations want to build, they are going to either the Fabric technology or the Ethereum technology for their private permissioned implementations. And there are many thousands of those that are either going on or about to be going on very soon. If you're interested in building in the public infrastructure, so the EOS project is drawing some not very good technologists and not very good projects to it, but really by orders of magnitude, the Ethereum ecosystem is drawing all that attention.
So I would like to open up the floor to questions, but I'm going to ask one final one of each of the panelists before that happens. So if you've got a question, think of it now, and we'll get to it. But I'd like to ask, the concept of this panel is, where's blockchain headed in 2019? Where is it headed in 2019?
Left to right? Well, so as I mentioned earlier, I think 2018 was a bit of a hangover for the whole industry. I think the fact that we've worked through some of the changes in the market, whether it's contractions, and Bitmain did a big layoff apparently. I think it's good to get that behind us. 2019, I think continues to be. I think there'll be more maturity of projects, of real use cases solving real problems. I think there'll be more transparency, as I described. I think we'll also get more transparency and clarity from U.S. regulators. We're kind of behind some of the global regulators about some of these technologies, and I think we'll start to see traditionally defined banks actually custody crypto as one prediction I've had for 2019.
Fidelity is jumping into that game, so
I've already made my predictions. I have to try harder.
We've had a lot of talk about the market side of it, which will just continue to, I think, solidify existing kind of pilots will go to production in a lot of different places. The existing ones that are in production will get more and more usage. On the developer side, we just had a Fabric 1.4 release, which is a long-term support release, meaning it is a platform you can build to for the next 18 to 24 months. We have other production releases coming up with Sawtooth and Hyperledger Indy, which is our distributed identity platform that will be paired with a production release of the Sovereign Foundations Network, which will be a overlay network for a distributed self-sovereign ID, already in pilot use by the governments of British Columbia, the Dutch government, and a cool digital identity network and KYC system for Sierra Leone as well. So really cool stuff, project like that. But on the developer side, developers like stability. They like a set of requirements. They like a set of users that allow them to do iterations on a very progressive level, not a VC-driven or a hype-driven kind of roadmap, but something that allows them from the bottoms up to harden and solidify the content, the software they're building. And so I'm really hopeful that 2019 will actually be kind of peaceful from that point of view, allow us to get this stuff to be at the production release that we needed to, production level we needed.
So on the public side, we're seeing massive breakthroughs in scalability. At layer 2 on top of Ethereum, we're seeing about 15 different technologies, 15 different approaches that are making use of the base layer and getting their security from the base heavily decentralized Ethereum layer. There are technologies, one called Plasma, and a specific implementation that can get 65,000 transactions per second in a blockchain system at layer 2. And so some of those are available right now. Some of them are being used by gaming systems and by exchanges. And over the next 6 months, we're going to see many more of those roll out. At that base layer, we're also seeing tremendous movement towards the release of Ethereum 2.0. Many are building a client already. In the next 3 months, I think many of those clients are going to sync on one of the major elements, something called the beacon chain, which is really the proof of stake backbone that we can hang 1,000 different Ethereum onto. Privacy and confidentiality, one of our projects released something called the Aztec protocol. So in addition to using Ethereum in private permission context with privacy and confidentiality on top of vanilla Ethereum, we are now going to be able to use this protocol on public mainnet to essentially have private and confidential transactions. Our client Pantheon has connected to public mainnet, and sometime in the next few weeks we're releasing version 1, which will not just connect to mainnet, but also be able to enable anyone using it to spin up private permissioned Ethereum blockchains as well.
So there are reasons for optimism amid the crypto slump. Let's take some questions from the audience. Maybe you can introduce yourself, name and title, or sure. Company, and.
My name is Nick von Christiers, and I'm head of Africa for DigiNex, which is a blockchain focused investment bank. Just out of it, I was quite surprised that there was no mention of the developing world when talking about blockchain in 2019. So my question is, in the context of sustainability and the developing world, what do you see as the kind of implications of this added layer of transparency and provenance, especially when a lot of the legacy intermediaries and governments aren't that incentivized for this new technology?
Okay, so how does the developing world fit into this equation? Whoever would like to take the question.
I'm always uncomfortable with the term developing world,
sure.
It's kind of, I would say, pejorative, but we see the supply chain applications that are at least really interesting to me from a social impact perspective being the diamond space. There's a tantalum supply chain blockchain out there being run by a company called Circular that looks at tantalum in Rwanda, trying to certify it comes from the right kinds of mines. Overall, the use case that pulled me into the blockchain space wasn't so much programmable money, or sovereign stores of value. It was auditability. It was the ability to take systems in countries where there isn't quite, let's just say, the respect for the rule of law or auditing systems or others that can make sure no matter what agreement you come to that there's fairness through that system, and instead change that. And so we're seeing, and that's a need that hits the developing world for sure, where there aren't strong institutions, and that's a role, I think, not just for good actors there, but also organizations like the World Bank, like the World Food Program, and others to bring in programs that can enhance that. But frankly, it's an issue in the developed world as well, where everybody who's remodeled your house, at least in the United States, you probably paid an expediter to get your paperwork through faster than the standard system. Those are the kinds of systems that if we remade them through blockchain tech, should be fairer, should be more transparent, and the whole world needs those kinds of systems. But pickup is global for both of our technologies, for sure.
You got a question over here? Oh, sorry.
We also do. I'll keep it short. We
quick.
also do a fair amount of work in some developing contexts, and essentially I have a social impact team that does work in refugee situations with identity, feeding people in that context, sending money directly into those contexts, which is a much more efficient way of doing it. and if you send tokens into a certain situation and enable those tokens to be traded for food or other goods, the money is used much more efficiently. So instead of a 30% haircut on the value that's sent into that region, because you've got all these intermediaries, there's like a 3% haircut. We've done work in tracking and storing information in war zones so that it can be used in war crime situations. So it's not all about catering to the sort of first world financial industry.
Question over here. Here you go.
Thank you. Kate Mitzelmacher, I'm the CEO and founder of Blockcelerate. It's a fund and an accelerator. Prior to starting the fund, I was working for Gartner. And a part of that, we tracked blockchain projects, and we tracked about 100 of them. So question is to you, Joe. You mentioned there's no lack of interest from enterprises in terms of doing POCs, but 99 out of 100 projects that we tracked actually failed to meet specific business outcomes. So the question is, how do you get to mainstream adoption that's past the POC stage, and what does mainstream adoption actually mean?
So when did you leave Gartner?
About a year ago.
There we go. So yes, that's absolutely true. Ray Valdez, who you probably worked with, I think he started that group. He joined ConsenSys over a year ago because he, despite seeing many failed POCs, he was incredibly excited with the potential of the technology, and he's doing a project in China right now, Xuan, which is a special economic zone close to Beijing, designed to, it's thought leadership, it's smart city. It's basically designed to take some of the pressure off Beijing. We are building projects that are getting used right now. 2017, absolutely, we weren't building real-world consortia, but one project that we have built out went live. I don't know if Manu is around or Sulema. Oh, there we go. Do you want to say one word? Why don't you do that? That'd be much better, actually.
So it's about commodity industry moving from POC to production stage. So we did it last year, based on a network of 15 companies backing us.
What's the project called?
Congo. So for Commodities Go, basically, incorporated in Geneva last year. So currently we're building the user base with our shareholders, and we're going to open it up to external users in the following weeks, basically. What we try to achieve here with the backing of those shareholders, is to have a significant part of the industry ready to behave as a friendly environment to help us build the product before opening up to the rest of the world. Obviously, we have 90% of the trading commodity finance market backing us. That is going to bring liquidity to the platform. So it will generate traction in the following weeks. And we're using Helido, which is doing an amazing setup for us, definitely.
Got a question back here.
And it went live in December, and there have been transactions on it already.
Thank you. Hi, Eric Schiermeier, co-founder of MySpace and Zynga, and I'm working on a blockchain game company. Think of it as blockchain Zynga. So, we think that games are going to be the mass adoption moment for the blockchain, and I'm just wondering what you guys think about games on the blockchain. Which blockchain is going to be the best for it? Who's going to be the most enticing, and that sort of thing.
I'll jump in real quickly. I think this is one area where maybe blockchain use is underhyped. I don't think people talk that much about blockchain use in gaming. I think it's incredibly interesting. In terms of which underlying blockchain's most efficient, that's, I think, a question of speed, scale, what have you. I don't think there's going to be a winner take all in that space, but I think certainly you're going to see interesting new projects in 2019 around that. I know there's a couple being built upon the XRP ledger, and I think it's going to be a very interesting space to watch in 2019.
Absolutely, I agree with that. Would love to hear what's being built on XRP. There already have been games released on the Ethereum platform. A public blockchain platform is ideal for that sort of thing. And I estimate between 10 and 20 significant games will be released in 2019. Many of them are bringing their own scalability technology. So if you have digital assets in a game, you might want, traditionally the assets have essentially been owned by the game publisher, and secondary markets do get created for what's called skins, basically ways of customizing some of the things that you own in those systems. There's a lot of in-game payment for different assets in those systems, and so having real ownership, having the ability to move assets from one game to another. There are already a few games, CryptoKitties and Gods Unchained, are totally different projects that are now starting to interoperate a little bit. There's a project called Crypto Rome and Crypto Horse Racing or something like that, where there's a standard on Ethereum that enables you to compose these natively digital tokens. So you can take a sword and a horse and a house and a bunch of land, and you can compose all of that into a single token and trade that and move that around in different markets. You can compose a bunch of those things into a town, and you can apply ownership to that particular town, and you can move those things from this Rome game to this horse game, and you can move them to an exchange and create eventually liquid deep markets in these crypto assets. Crypto assets are already multi-billion-dollar market, I believe, and so it's really just going to accelerate. It's going to provide tremendous synergies across the industry.
We're running past 12 o'clock, but since we started late, I'm going to take a few more questions. We've got one over here from my colleague, Claire. By the way, when is this game going to be available?
End of the year, probably.
Okay, cool.
Hi, I'm Claire Zillman. I'm Robert's colleague at Fortune. Joe, I just wanted to ask about your T-shirt, Women in Blockchain on an all-male panel. I'm just wondering what steps you're taking, each of you, to make sure the potential of this market, or this market is inclusive in terms of who benefits, who contributes to it.
A great question.
Great. Yeah.
Also, you should
going to hand it over to you.
Take the moderator spot.
Yeah. So first the shirt was given to me by Tessie Moraine. I think she's the founder of this group. She's been with ConsenSys since nearly the start, and it's a group that educates and fosters adoption, has meetups. So generally, is very active in promoting blockchain. Last year, this lounge, why don't you?
Just give me the mic. All right. No, I know. I'm the one who programmed the panel, and my thinking has actually evolved really enormously on, there was a spirit in previous years of making sure that there was a woman on every panel about blockchain really rigorously. And I actually think that I was going over the program this year, and there are so many women on the program, and there are so many women that are leading in blockchain, that arbitrarily making sure there's always one of each gender on every panel seemed like so last year to me. I'm not asking about cool. So I just totally. And the industry, I think, I'm happy to give it to them, but I just wanted to clear that up about my thinking on the panel.
Yeah, so 3 of the most powerful women in blockchain are sitting right here. They're all closely associated with ConsenSys. It's absolutely a problem, and it's not, diversity is a problem in our industry, and we've been focusing four of the most, sorry about that, Vanessa. It's something that we pay a ton of attention to. We were very explicit about how we structured the panels last year. Amanda felt that wasn't necessary, and it was almost antithetical to put somebody, just choose the best people. There are enough women that we can choose to put on panels so that all the panels are great, and we'll get pretty close to 50-50 representation.
This hasn't been widely reported yet, but a couple of months ago, the chairwoman of our board, Blythe Masters, led a vote at the Hyperledger governing board to take the governing board to be equal representation, men and women, within 2 years. Now, 2 years is a long time. It takes a while to kind of turn over board members, and I've got one here who can help attest to verify this fact. But that's an attempt to say, top down as well as bottoms up, we have to try to solve this problem.
About 40% of Ripple's board is women today. About 40% of our management team are women, and I agree with Joe that it is a macro problem. I don't think it's unique to blockchain. Silicon Valley data speaks for itself, not in a good way on this point. I think that there's progress being made, but we got a long way to go.
Over here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Chris Purifoy. I'm with an AI and blockchain protocol called Learning Economy. We're trying to solve the skills gap. My question is this: we're at the UNGA, we were at G20, now Davos. Everyone seems to be talking about a desperate need for coordination and collaboration to actually solve some of the sustainable development goals. I feel like blockchain is the solution for that. I'd be curious to know if you think the same way.
I think that is hard. One of the things that Ripple gets asked a lot about is there's a lot of, I'm going to speak of the U.S. Lobbying groups, if you will. There's 4 or 5 different associations have been kicked off in Washington, D.C. to presumably organize blockchain enablers and to engage the government. It's really, really hard because there's such a spectrum of projects and a spectrum of people and how they view the government. Joe said something earlier which I agree with. Within every community, there's people who are on the far fringe, kill the government, kill the banks, and you have people that are, using his word, pragmatic. I think it's really hard right now in the holy war stage we are in of some of these crypto projects to get great universal alignment. I think Hyperledger's done a pretty good job of it. Ripple is a participant. We contributed some IP through something called Interledger Protocol. That they have a project called Quilt, in kind of a layer 3 technology of interoperability between these projects. But I think we've got a long way to go on that.
For me, I've been into the open source space for 20 years. Since before it was called open source, right? And for me, blockchain technology is the kind of the manifestation of that same cooperative nature that drove people to do what seemed economically insane, which is give away IP to your competitors without any expectation of give back, right? But now is the heart of almost all the IT systems out there, right? And it didn't mean that it was the only model. There was certainly lots of room for proprietary licensing on top of common source code, right? Common platforms. But now we have a way to take that beyond the source code to the platforms, the systems, the running, buzzing, kind of data flows and such that we share between organizations. And that's what blockchain technology provides. So this is really, for me, just the next chapter in helping understand how do we get cooperatives going in the technology.
I think we've got time for maybe 1, maybe 2 questions. We'll take this one back here.
Can I just do a quick one for him? So we have absolutely been about cooperation, collaboration for a long time. Across blockchain to storage protocols. We've been working together for a very long time. Sophia's team, the Kaleido team, you've got 12, 15 people who are intimately familiar with the fabric technology, I believe. Tim Grant is here. He was one of the main drivers of the R3 Corda ecosystem. He's now roughly a ConsenSys. He's building on the Ethereum technology. He's also still using Corda in one of the projects that they're putting together. So it's such an immature ecosystem. We need to stay open-minded. We're building new protocols. We just released something called Faye, which is a virtual machine that we can link into Ethereum. 2019 is definitely going to be a heavy interledger year, and everybody's warming up, I think.
Hi, I'm Inhyuk Cha from SK Telecom. I'm also working with Korean government, National Smart City projects. Question is, we're in Davos, so this question is about Davos contextual. Right before the start of this week, there was a report about the growing, concentration of wealth. Because we are all living in the capitalist society, investing society, I think a lot of people are thinking that one way to help slow that trend is by enabling more people to become micro-capitalist investors, cooperative maybe. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts maybe are. And what in my country, in Korea, for example, there are 2 very, very bad problems. One is that a lot of the land, because it's so dense, land is owned by only the wealthy. So there's this gentrification. Normal people, even people in the middle class, do not get the opportunity to be able to invest in highly appreciating real estate pieces. So there's a gap, right? The other thing, as a country, and this will probably apply to many other countries that are outside of the core economic powerhouses, is the inability to participate in the dominant markets, which usually, historically, are much better performing. So these are just two examples, but what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, so greater...
So is it correct to say, how is cryptocurrency going to address or blockchain going to address the inequality
because
gap?
you are the decentralized, you are the socially aware, forces.
Yeah, so greater agency, more equitable distribution, more equitable distribution of power in addition to wealth is one of the central theses of the Ethereum project and essentially public blockchain. So we have a project that's tokenizing real estate that will enable fractional ownership of real estate, so that somebody with $10 or $100 could potentially get exposed to that particular asset class. Ethereum, with respect to music or art or any sort of content, has always been focused on disintermediation, essentially pulling the lawyers, the music companies, et cetera, out of that transactional flow. We still need intermediaries, but intermediaries currently extract too much value from those order flows. So having content creators being able to much more directly access their consumers will enable them to do better on these platforms. And having governance systems for these protocol-based open platforms will enable all the different participants in those systems to have greater agency in how those systems are governed. It's a big, complicated thing, whether it's centralized or decentralized, so it's going to take time to build these systems. But this is the right platform. The previous platform forced us to build in siloed infrastructure, and the technology that was available enabled the people who are good at deploying that technology to pile on wealth higher and higher than ever before. But I believe with essentially open platforms for different industries where we can collaborate more and share the value of the protocol, I believe many more entities will be able to be on that platform without the intermediaries extracting massive rents.
I'm worried at the core, but I'm optimistic at the periphery. What I mean by that is the word blockchain, for many people, is defined by the Winklevoss twins and Lamborghinis, right? On the periphery, I'm really encouraged that it's possible to build systems. So David Treat, who is here, I think he walked out, talked about kind of provenance tracking systems for, say, coffee, where when you drink a good cup of coffee, you like it, you want to tip the farmer, making sure that the 10 cents or dollar goes all the way back to the farmer, and they see much greater value than they saw when they were just selling into a faceless, amorphous, kind of massive a redistribution supply chain, right? So there's the potential, but I think we all have to be cognizant any of these technologies are kind of neutral, and they do depend upon not just big central technology companies or others kind of pushing it out there and driving efficiency. It depends upon innovation at the edge. And so that's where education is really important, trying to build communities outside of the ordinary tech capitals or finance capitals around these technologies, and really drive auditability and holding parties to account as like a core value of these systems.
I think that's a great answer to leave off on. As as all these leaders that have convened here in Davos start thinking about building the next global economy, how do we make sure that the tide lifts all boats? So that's something we can all ruminate on after we leave this room. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.